Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Ambra Skadro, National Assessment System Officer within PFC International. The webinar of today is for presenting the South African regional system and to launching the consultation for the endorsement assessment of this year. Today with me we have Steve from SAFAS, which will present the system and let you know more about the South African system. So I'll leave the floor to you, Steve, if you want to share your presentation. And
Great,
then,
thanks very much.
yeah, if anyone has any question, you can type them in the chat, or after the presentation, we will have a question and answer session.
Right, so that's all tested it, should be able to share. You've got your window, there we go. Right, is that showing a slideshow?
Yes, I can see your screen and you are on the first slide.
Right. Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for this opportunity. This is the start of the consultation. We've submitted our system for endorsement, and during the process of mandatory re-endorsement, we upgraded the system to be a regional scheme, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. And also tell you about the standards and how we arrived at the certain changes we've made, and a little bit of some of the challenges we're facing in introducing PFC to South Africa. So we'll start off with the ecological and biophysical context. That's always important because from that flows policies and the framework by how forestry operates.
Sorry to interrupt you. We are still seeing slide number 1. I'm not sure if you already moved on.
Did the slide not move?
No, it's not moving. So
it moved during testing. That's always fun.
Yep.
Okay, so let me stop sharing.
Okay.
And then I'm going to share again, but this time I want to share screen. Let's just try that. Okay, if I'm sharing screen now, are you seeing the first slide?
First slide, yes.
Now let's just get rid of your. And now if we move it on, no, that doesn't move on.
It is not moving.
Oh, that's annoying. I promise you it was working. Okay, let's just try again. Okay, so this time I'll share screen. I'll share window. Window not moving.
We can see slide number 1.
Can you see slide number 2?
Yes, now it's moving on. Yeah.
With a bit of luck, it'll keep doing the same thing. Okay. So we're going to look at the ecological and biophysical context. We're going to look at the economic contribution that forestry makes in South Africa, something about ownership structures, a bit of the history of PFC in South Africa. How do you get PFC to work in South Africa? Progress of PFC and some of the barriers that we're contending with and how we propose to deal with them. An introduction to the structure, the regional scheme, the concept of it, the standard development process. How did we go about developing our standards? And then some of the key changes that we've introduced as a result of the gap analysis. Hopefully, as it moved on, are we on track? You see a new slide?
I'm still seeing the index. Now it is moved on. Yeah.
So this should be a slide that shows quite a complex slide showing natural forests versus what we term the forestry landscape. So in South African context, one has to understand that only about 0.4 of South Africa's land cover are natural forests, what we call natural forests. These forests are highly diverse ecosystems. It can be actually up to 700 species of woody plants and a number of herbaceous species and fairly high levels of endemism. And these are absolutely protected in South Africa, and they have been since legislation was passed in the early 1900s. Whereas if you look at the actual plantation forestry landscape where production takes place, these are plantations that have been established in non-forest habitats, and the actual landscape is a mixture. It's a mosaic of natural habitats which are protected as conservation areas and plantation areas which are harvested. A little bit more about that. To understand the context, South Africa has the following are the major biomes, and we've got the savanna biome, which is fairly sparse trees and grass cover, normally in a rainfall range of between about 400 and 800, and that's about a third of the country's land. And then grasslands make up another almost 30%, and fall in slightly higher rainfall areas. And these are the areas where most of the plantation development's taken place. You need in excess of 800 millimeters of rain to have an effective plantation forest. The other habitats, the Karoo habitats are semi-desert habitats, very low rainfall. Then in the Western Cape, we've got the fynbos, which I'll tell you a bit more about just now, and they can have very high rainfall. There's some plantation development in the fynbos. And then the other habitats are desert. There's a small area of true desert, some thicket areas, and then natural forests, which I mentioned is only 0.5% of our land coverage, and then Indian Ocean coastal belt, which is a mix of habitats. Let me just, sorry, I've got your little window there. Okay. Skip to slide, mistake. Right. Are you seeing a slide titled Forest Production?
Yes.
Okay. So we have about 1.2 million hectares of plantation forests in South Africa, producing about 16.5 million tons of logs. That gives us a mean annual increment of about 13.75. And this is focused on the pulp and paper sector, with and the sawn timber from the pine sector mainly. Then we have another area which is invasive alien plants, which are effectively, we termed unmanaged plantations here, but they're from a range of sources. But the majority of this area is resulting from the introduction of plantation species. And that's been happening for more than a century into the country, and these species were either hand sown and then formally planted in plantations, and they've had a real impact on the country. It's estimated this area is growing rapidly, both vertically and in density, and it's estimated that there could be 20 million tons per annum coming from this sort of area, but it's not currently being exploited. So there's currently some charcoal production there, and then some sort of ad hoc local timber use, but there's no formalized industry that is exploiting this to its full capacity for various structural and administrative reasons, and one reason or another, which we're going to go into a little bit. Then you get your natural forest area, which only amounts to about 500,000 hectares, and there's negligible production in these areas. There's some very controlled harvesting that happens occasionally to produce some local boutique type furniture utilization, but it's not part of the main commercial forestry stream. And then the savanna is not used in the forestry value chain to any extent. A really salient feature about South Africa is it's on the balance a water scarce country, because only on the eastern half of the country in the highlands do we get the majority of our rainfall. And this rainfall supplies agricultural sector, the industrial sector, the forestry sector, and it's there's a lot of competition for this land. And all those areas that you see in dark blue are the areas where forestry has been concentrated, and a lot of it planted in the catchment areas. So as a result of this, there's been legislation passed that to license plantations as water users. And this means that there's very little plantation growth in South Africa. It's anticipated, in fact, over the last 10 years, there's been a reduction in the production in the forestry area due to excising areas for water. So that's a key feature. So if South African forestry is going to grow in production, it's going to grow in terms of improving the genetic stock, improving silviculture, etc. Just wanted to say something about grasslands, because that's a subject close to my heart. The grasslands have absorbed 95% of plantation forests are in the grassland biome, and we need to understand that the grasslands themselves are really ancient fire-prone ecosystems where there's extremely high number of threatened ecosystems and species. And so almost every vegetation type in the grassland biome has quite a high protection requirement. There's over 4,000 species in the grasslands, very high levels of endemism. It's rich in medicinal plants, and it's also highly impacted by livestock. So which grasslands remain are also very compromised by livestock. And the grasslands occur in the economic heartland of South Africa and Eswatini, and these are also the water production areas. So to give you the picture, forestry is taking place in a highly contested space. And then the little bit of forestry that's going into the Cape Floristic region is also known as fynbos, but there's quite a few other vegetation types that make it up. There are some plantations there, but there's been a big move to excise and remove plantations from the Cape Floristic region and the Western Cape in general, because it's far from markets, not very productive, and also because it is spreading seed up into the catchment areas, and it's not seen as a desirable condition for ecological situation. The Cape Floristic region is a global biodiversity hotspot in of itself. It comprises an entire floral kingdom, global floral kingdom, extremely high plant diversity. I think it's the highest temperate habitat in existence in terms of floral diversity, very high levels of endemism, extremely complex and interesting ecology with complex pollination systems, but also essential for the fruit industry and other industries that have occurred in the Western Cape. It's also fire driven, and fire is a critical element of its biodiversity, and it's also essential for water security. So just to give you a picture of what happens with forestry then. So the forestry develops by getting water use license and planting trees into the grassland and to a small degree fynbos. And the actual plantation area is largely denuded of any real biodiversity value or conservation value. The objective is to leave a network of open areas and not plant the ecologically important areas such as water shedding areas or areas around high biodiversity, rocky areas and such like, so that there's a patchwork, and that this is being to create corridors and retain as much biodiversity as possible in the landscape. Forestry's done moderately well in this respect, but it can be improved a lot by improving alien plant management. Just to reiterate, our standards then have been created to address all these issues that we bring up. There's a long history of standards to address this through the FSC history as well. So there's a lot of material to draw on when developing standards in South Africa. This just reiterates that it's a patchwork landscape, and just must highlight that there are something like in excess of 30 formally protected areas, IUCN category nature reserves or protected environments within the forestry landscape. So, and there's large portions of biodiversity that forestry contributes to quite substantially the conservation of those areas. The other thing to keep in mind is the importance of fire in this whole scenario. Plantations were established in the areas that are most prone to fire, which are the grasslands, and therefore fire protection is absolutely critical. There's been quite a bit of interesting research in this area. This research by Kurt Kaldenes in 1994 demonstrated clearly that where the wind is intense is where you get your grasslands and your non-forest ecosystems, and where there's wind shadows, you get your woody vegetation proliferating, because that the windy areas are where the fires move. So it's the absence of fire that creates the conditions where woody vegetation can grow. And if you cease to burn grasslands, they become increasingly woodified, and you get forest development at the expense of biodiversity. The other thing about controlling your fires is that it can have a devastating impact on your production and on your equipment and on lives. So apart from the fact, and the other thing to throw in is that regular fire regimes are required to keep grassland biodiversity intact, and so you have to burn grassland patches within forestry and make sure you don't burn the forests or plantations. Right, so moving on to the administrative structures around forestry. Forestry has benefited substantially by having a strong association leading it, and in the form of Forestry South Africa. And Forestry South Africa is critical to a lot of work around advocacy. They support research to a large extent and represent the industry in a number of fora. They provide environmental and sustainability guidance, and are involved lobbying and being active on labor and social issues in forestry. They also deal a lot with small grower sector and communal growing growers, helping training, capacity building in sectors where there's lack of skills. They've also been involved in some key legal and technical questions by providing legal support to some key areas such as water use licensing and that sort of thing. Forestry is also involved in any other sustainability challenges such as climate change, supporting climate change projects, etc. So virtually every forest owner is a member. I think up to 93% of forest owners are actual members of FSA and contribute to maintaining FSA. In fact, a lot of the slides that you see here, these slides that I'm presenting now, are all from the FSA, work that FSA does and makes this information available to users. So it's useful for communication. Right, so on to what contribution does forestry make to the economy of South Africa? It's a 38 billion rand sector, which is it's about a $2 billion sector, contributing more than 0.5% of the country's overall GDP. It's quite important to understand that it is considered part of the agricultural sector in terms of its economic contribution, and produces about 10% of South Africa's agricultural GDP. And interestingly, nearly 5% of South Africa's manufacturing GDP also comes from solid wood products and paper. We've got large, vertically integrated, globally important companies such as Sappi and Mondi, and they are important for the economy. Also important for employment. The figures are there, something like 50,000 plus people are directly employed in forestry, and in forest products, additional 50,000 plus. And then there's a lot of families that indirectly benefit from forestry. So to understand the distribution of who's owning timber plantations, the majority are privately owned, 18.4% are publicly owned in two structures. Some are directly owned by the Department of Environmental, Forestry and Fisheries. There's been a long ongoing move for this this ownership to be exchanged or moved to other ownership, either to part of the land reform process or in trusts or taken over by companies. It's been a slow process. It's sort of happening very slowly, if at all. And the other government-owned forests are owned through a parastatal company called Safcol, and they incidentally were the first company to get certified in South Africa. Most of the forest land, 63%, are owned by 11 large corporates, and the two massive ones that we mentioned earlier are the global giants Mondi and Sappi. Then about 15% are medium-scale timber growers. So these would be farmers that are either dedicated to forestry or are mixed farmers, and they own some trees and some other crops. And there's a good complementarity between those two different land uses, and it allows them to maximize their production. With the forests or the plantations acting as a sort of a sink of money to sort of tide them over and even out their cash flow. There's also a number of small-scale growers. So while it says only 3.8% are small-scale timber growers, some of these actually own as little as half a hectare. And these are really small woodlots around, in communal areas around housing and farming, local subsistence, almost subsistence farming, etc. And that's one sector which is important to the industry and be growing in importance because of land reform. So some of these skilled foresters are actually acquiring land through the land reform process and then able to grow their assets and become larger in the industry. So talking about landscapes, so forestry really takes different forms, and the standards have to deal with a number of different scenarios. And we have done that in the standard by creating verifiers for different contexts. So for forestry that occurs in communal or tribal authority land, this is where there's no fixed land ownership and people occupy land. They're given permission to grow crops and trees and reside on land that is owned by a trust. In the case of, there's a few trusts set up. One is the Ngonyama Trust in KZN, and this is run as sort of tribal authorities, which are effectively chiefdoms, but they also work with the municipal authorities to get services delivered. And in such an area, you'll get a landscape of scattered trees and agriculture with homesteads in between. And some of the standards are tailored for that context. Then we've got mixed farming, and you'd get an owner of land which is growing, in this case, illustration, sugarcane with some trees, and we need a certification so they can deal with small amounts of trees on a mixed farming situation. Then we can have corporate owned large scale, often mechanized operations, which are highly monotypic and often very much part of an integrated production system. Or you get privately owned farms where you get an owner manager, and they're also standards tailored for the owner manager because they're less a shorter chain of command, and it's easier to ensure that things get done. So they have less requirements for documentation in the standard. So let me just have Right, so I wanted to give a little history of forest certification in South Africa. It is important to understand that PFC wasn't the first there. In 1997, SAFCOL was the first FSC certificate in South Africa. And it's interesting to note that by 2000, over 80% of commercial forestry in South Africa was already FSC certified. And what I didn't put on the slide there, but between sort of 2010 and 2020, chain of custody certificates grew from something like 20 to 200 by FSC chain of custody. So there was a massive growth. And so I'm giving you the picture that when we brought PFC into South Africa, it was into an environment that already had very high levels of certification and a sense of loyalty to FSC. However, there are very few smallholders, smaller commercial farmers or communal landowners certified, and we'll deal a little bit with what those barriers are. In 2016, then, South African Forestry, some companies formed a working group and started to bring PFC into South Africa. And the objective of this was to very explicitly improve access for small growers. It was also looked at as a tool to mitigate the risk of FSC becoming untenable, difficult to implement in South Africa. There were two key areas. The standards around chemicals were becoming more and more onerous, and there was a fear that FSC was not favorable to plantations, and we're trying to phase out the concept of controlled wood, all which would make it quite risky. So PFC was brought in. PFC was also hoped that it would open more markets, and there might be some, especially with shifts in marketing and demands to look at other markets in Asia, etc. PFC might help that, and also to provide a standard that's more aligned to plantation forestry in South Africa, so a standard that was easy to implement and maybe more effective as a tool to improve forest management. So what was the progress once FSC was brought in? So PFC was brought into an FSC environment in 2016 by adapting the National Principal Criterion Indicators and Standards. So South African government already had principles, criteria, and indicators and standards which were mandated to be converted into an auditable standard. And so the process of developing PFC enabled them to meet that mandate. In May 2017, South Africa became a PFC member. The system was endorsed in 2018, and the first accreditation happened later. In fact, I think it was 2019. In 2020, SAPI received their first certificate under PFC. In 2022, we got SGS, was also accredited. The system was submitted for endorsement in 2024, and by 2025, there are 6 FM certificates, and that's about 45% of forestry land in South Africa is now PFC. Most of it's dual certified, FSC and PFC, but there's one company that's only PFC certified. And there's some farmers, smaller farmers on a group scheme that are only PFC certified, but they wouldn't make up 5% of that. And in terms of COC, the NGB managed 16 COC certificates. There are 39 COC chain of custody holders in South Africa, but those are housed in other countries, and these are just branches, so the audits are done through other countries. And that's 16 COCs, because it's actually a very low number, and the prognosis for growth is poor, because there's 200 and something FSC COCs, and approaching those companies, they are reticent to get PFC until the international market demands it. So it is a challenge to grow this. And the other thing that's happened in terms of progress is we have established this regional scheme now, which has been submitted for endorsement. Right, so just to reiterate some of the barriers to PFC growth in the region, all the major companies are FSC already. Companies that buy timber from small and medium scale operations pay higher prices for FSC than they do for PFC. In fact, there's usually no difference between PFC and uncertified in terms of the price that they'll pay. So there's one or two companies that offer a small premium for PFC, but so it's a clear signal that companies want FSC. Small scale growers have poor legal compliance. It's difficult to get them any sort of certification. And the barriers to legal compliance are very high, very difficult, and that's a whole topic which we've been working at hard. The global market demands FSC, and there's lack of resources for PFC. So PFC International has provided us with, fee reductions every year, and has supported projects such as the regional scheme project. But even so, 25 to 30% of our income from our notification fees goes to PFC membership fees or cost for external reviews. And there's very little left for management or growth or promotion. The national governing body can only support half a person's time to run it. So it's a difficult situation, which we explain how we intend getting out of and bringing a PFC forward. Very few certificates and very little growth on the COC side. So certificate holders are reluctant to pay additional money to get PFC and support the NGB. So it's difficult to go back to the current certificate holders and ask and increase our fees, because they're already pushing back on the existing fee structure. So how are we tackling this is, PFC International has looked at the situation and wants to assist our NGB to provide a value chain study, to have a look and to see how we can activate growth by understanding the forestry value chain in the Southern African situation. And we're going to identify the key organizations, analyze their stakeholders and priorities, the duplication, they create a market strategy through this, and also see how these findings can plug into the regional scheme. Okay, so now I want to just go into the regional scheme and its structure and what's been achieved so far. The concept was for the SAFAS national governing body to be the central holder of the key supporting documents, and for each country that joins to have their own standards, that they'll be on their own revision cycle, and the standard can be built on the template provided by the SAFAS, so as long as we're dealing with countries with plantation forestry. And the first country to come on board was Eswatini, an obvious choice because Eswatini's industry is highly integrated with the South African industry, and its ecological context is very similar. There are legislative differences, quite substantial ones, but so Eswatini has completed its draft standard and is about to send it out for consultation, for local consultation. That process is running quite well. They've established an NGB, and we're hoping that this year that NGB will apply for membership. We've had a lot of interest from Namibia, and Namibia started an interest group, which will morph into an NGB over time. And they're very interested in promoting PFC in Namibia, particularly for the charcoal sector, but also for high quality furniture production that comes from timber up in the north. And then we've had interest from Mozambique. And once we've established the scheme and we have Eswatini on board, we can pursue the Mozambique option as well. And then start working on other countries such as Angola, where there's potential, Zambia, and there's no reason to keep it in the SADC region other than proximity. It's possible that if interest was shown by Kenya and other countries, we could grow the scheme using the same principles. So the objectives of the regional scheme would be to promote and enhance sustainable forest management in the region as a broader objective, and to reduce the costs and administrative burden of certification for member countries. A huge barrier for coming on board PFC is just the administration of the system. Most of these countries have very small forest industries, and it wouldn't warrant learning and training someone to do the administration. So the objective is to get the SAFAS office to take over the administration of the smaller member countries. To increase ease of access to PFC certification, and to be instrumental in promoting certification to improve local export markets. There's a big drive in Africa to improve inter-African trade, and it's seen that potentially a PFC endorsed system will be far easier to implement and far more amenable to African countries for facilitating local trade, and also local and interregional trade. So those would be the targets there. How would it structure? How does it work? Well, the SAFAS would form a regional committee, and the regional committee would contain one member from each joining country, and each country has its own FM standard, as I mentioned before, but there's a central suite of documents which include the CB requirements, the group certification requirements, chain of custody and trademark standards, and then the standard setting procedures, accreditation and notification agreements. Those documents and a dispute resolution, those documents are all common to everybody in the group. They don't have to develop those. They just have to develop their standards, and they can develop them on templates provided by SAFAS. And we find that it helped Eswatini substantially to have a template to work through. Another thing about developing with African countries is, for example, in Namibia, they were overhauling forest policy, and they are currently in that process. And if we can get in while that process is going on, then it's easier to develop standards in parallel to those processes. The system documents, so that the SAFAS system has a standard setting procedure, which has been revised. We've also revised the forest management standard. Obviously, we've and I'll show you what we've landed, the process in aligning it to the latest version of the PFC benchmark. The group certification procedures, we've adopted very strongly the PFC benchmark. Certification and accreditation procedures have been completely revised as well. The the notification and trademark usage standards are updated, as well as the dispute resolution is fairly standard. And then we've retained, using the PEFC chain of custody standard, the CB requirements and trademark usage for the meta standards. We've also had to introduce the description of the regional scheme, which explains the workings and administration of the regional scheme. And then with each joining country, we have a memorandum of understanding. We have one with Eswatini, and Eswatini has, the national governing body has been set up by an industry organization in Eswatini called Business Eswatini, which represents broader business, and they've set up a subcommittee within that to be the national governing body. And then we've provided a document which explains the South African forestry context for the revision of the South African standard and the EUDR modifications. For the EUDR modifications, we've described for each modification, we have created a document which describes how South Africa has dealt with those modifications, and the same approach will apply for Eswatini. We've got a small working group comprising representatives of the large companies, and with Trudy Sibelebele from SAPI. SAPI also provided someone to represent the small scale growers, the really communal level. We've got a business and industry representative, an independent consultant in David Everard. We've got Alana Dutoy, who represented the NGO sector. I was on the working group representing scientific and technical aspects. We had Makale Ngwenya, who has experience with unions and helped and advises on the National Forestry Advisory Council. Then there are a number of members who preferred to be on the advisory panel, and this was an advisory panel which allowed us to consult on very specific and targeted aspects of the standard. Very useful to have someone from DWS, John van Giza, and John Scotcher from a very experienced consultant who consulted the FSA, and Justin Yakudanga, who's a private consultant with lots of experience on the workers and small-scale forestry. The revision started with a gap analysis, and we analyzed global policy changes that we might need to make. We obviously have to adapt at that. At the time of developing it, it was the PEFC 2018 benchmark. During the process, the 2024 benchmark was introduced, and we also worked with that. We need to consider the approach to the EUDR. Extensive work was done on that. We considered the possibility of trees outside forests and decided that on this iteration, we wouldn't introduce it yet. And any other new things that arose, we looked at. Some smaller editorial changes or definitional changes. In the South African legislation, there was a new piece of legislation introduced, was the greenhouse gas regulations requiring all operations over 100 hectares to report on their carbon storage and emissions. That we introduced standards for that. And we also had to revise forest-related definitions in relation to the concept of deforestation in the South African context. And a lot of that was also in response to EUDR. And then there was some changes in the interpretations or the requirements for water use licensing as a result of a Forestry South Africa court case, which they were successful, and it changed some of the crucial processes in that. We had to adapt the standard for that. And then any lessons that learned from implementation, through the implementation phase, we'd been getting suggestions from CBs or from companies on how to strengthen the standard, and some of the substantive issues was strengthening the approach to permitted chemicals, using the industry list of chemicals as a guideline, as a requirement for the standard. And there was a bunch of very useful editorial and structural aspects which were introduced to improve the auditability, and then aspects around conversion. Timeline of the revision. Revision kicked off in October of 2022, the beginning of October 2022. And we started off by doing stakeholder identification, and then not much happened for the rest of the year. And then we revised the standard setting procedures, announced the process. At the same time, a call for working group members. Members were nominated, and we announced the working group by June. And also the same for the advisory panel, and they were announced. So we had an advisory panel and a working group installed by June, which then we then conducted the gap analysis and decided the gap analysis made us realize that we did need a complete revision. We weren't able to opt for one of the shortcut systems like the editorial revision, etc. We had to go for the full revision. And then the actual revision started with an inquiry draft, which was drafted. The working group then, once the working group had formulated the inquiry draft, was sent out for stakeholder consultation, the 60 days. We had working group meetings. And in the interim, once the consultation ended, we produced draft 2 of the standard. Then we had a forestry, at the behest of the forest industry of FSA's Environmental Management Committee, we had a forest industry workshop because they had some specific issues they wanted to address. And then we had quite a few meetings with PEFC Technical on EUDR compliance, and a number of very useful meetings in terms of our definitions, etc. So that delayed a little bit the submission. But we had had our final draft approved by the working group and submitted by the 7th of March, 2025. A little bit about stakeholders. We had the following categories. We had business and industry, then we had certification, we had community stakeholders, environmental stakeholders, government, labor and research level stakeholders. And the numbers are there, 38 stakeholders in the business and industry. It's slanted towards business and industry. And quite a lot of government stakeholders, 24 of those. Environmental stakeholders included one provincial conservation agency responded, and we have fairly well represented in the research category through the universities and through the Institute of Commercial Forestry Research. The stakeholder input was every response was responded to in writing and put in a report. And the summary of those, and I won't read through all of this, but there was a lot on clarification of definitions. A lot of stakeholders were concerned about definitional issues and aligning it with EUDR and the issue of deforestation. Forest and land use issues. So again, it led to definitions about what are planted forests, what are naturally regenerated forests, and through a series of meetings, the current version that you will find on the website now has the best compromise that we could between different views on those issues. Water use licensing, there was a lot of call for us to clarify this current situation regarding the water use licensing in light of the court case, and also in light of the requirements by traditional authority members, by communal areas. A lot to do with alien plant management, suggestions to improve the clarity on the management of AIP operations or in alien invasive plant operations, aligning them with statutory NEMBA requirements. The National Environmental Biodiversity Act has specific requirements for management plans for alien plants, and we aligned the system with those. We aligned our standards with those. Around management plans and documentation, scale-based flexibility in this term, in these, and so that we are a bit more explicit in the verifiers in terms of the requirements for management plans and documentations to make access for smaller scale operations that don't require so much emphasis on documentation more accessible. And then a little bit on stakeholder engagement and rights. There was several debates on definitional issues of Indigenous people in South Africa. And it's quite contentious in South Africa. I won't go into the detail because the one school of thought says that the true Indigenous people in South Africa are the Khoisan people, and they don't interact with forestry very much. And there's also a school of thought saying that the Bantu people are in fact Indigenous. And it's that issue that we're seeking consistency between the standards, and we think we've got a good balance. And we also have to be consistent across the FSC and PEFC standard, because you can't have completely different approaches between different systems because the same CBs are audited. So that was sort of quite an issue of debate. Okay, so looking at the actual structure of the SAFAS standard has 7 principles, and the one looking at planning, legal compliance, and chain of custody. The key principle of the SAFAS standard remains that we don't have a whole principle focused only on planning, but rather have the planning requirements, the monitoring requirements distributed throughout the standard wherever it's pertinent. That decreases duplication in the system. We've engagement with stakeholders and protection of cultural heritage is principle 2. 3 is looking at the protection of workers and human rights. 4 is protection of soil, carbon, and water. 5 is the conservation of biodiversity and ecological integrity. 6 is around forest health and protection, very much focused on the production side, and then 7 on the economic sustainability. Right, so the last section I'm going to go through is a little bit on what some improvements we made on the standards. We can't go through all of it, obviously, but there's some key things I'd like to just highlight here. And the first one is in relation to the changes that were introduced around the change of interpretation around the National Water Act, and that was a movement of the date for legality. Trees that were planted or that were in existence during the qualifying period, so between October 96 and September 1998, are registered with the department as a stream flow reduction activity. Any of those would be considered legal, whereas previously there was 1972 was the cutoff date. So this has changed the picture quite substantially in terms of ability people to access certification. In other words, if they've registered and their plantations were established prior to 1998, they can get certified and then wait for the process of the mandatory licensing to take place. Also, a verifier which is more specific on alien plant operations, being aligned to the requirements of NEMBA. This standard 5.2.2 talks about taking steps towards reducing invasiveness of plantation forests. And we've made specific that for invasive alien plant management operations, the rehabilitation of sites to land use that no longer supports the spread of IAPs in progress. So in other words, if you are rehabilitating the land or restoring it, the new land use will be a land use where we do not see the continued spread of alien plants. And that's a huge issue, as I mentioned, particularly in the Western Cape, where plantations are spreading. Abandoned plantations continue to spread seed up into the catchment areas, cause a huge loss of biodiversity, impacts on fire and water security. And then the other big standard change was the requirement to report carbon stocks and emissions for plantations over 100 hectares. And that was introduced as a verifier under 4.3.3, which was steps are taken to improve carbon stocks. So the two ways to improve carbon stocks is first you measure, and then the other one's around managing soil carbon. Right, so that's all I've prepared today. Thank you very much. I think we can go to questions.
Thank you very much, Steve, for the very nice presentation. It was very nice to hear all these details, starting from the general presentation of the national context and then the challenges that you faces during the revision process. If anyone has any question, you can raise your hand and then I can unmute you if needed. Yes, sorry, I can see there is already one question from Val. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
There we go.
Hello?
Okay. Hi, can you hear me? Yes?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Okay. Hi, Stephen. So this was really nice overview after our conversation that we had last week. And you'll probably guess part of what my question's about. The one thing is I'm surprised to see so few people on the call, and I'm there because I said to them, oh, you know what, this presentation is happening, and I came across it. It's a pity we didn't know about it earlier, and then I would have been able to get other people involved. But how do we manage to adjust it further so that areas that are not necessarily plantation forests can be recognized from a conservation and a biodiversity perspective in terms of reducing the invasive alien plant content? How can we make this connection implicit in the PEFC standards? And I know that's not an easy question to answer, but it's so critical to the conservation imperative of the country and the region, actually, specifically because if charcoal is being produced, putting some kind of an FSC or PEFC standard on it, probably 50 to 60% of it is actually coming from invasive plants.
Precisely, Val. The way that it currently is framed is that you require quite a rigorous and strenuous protocol. So so the requirements are that if you have a plantation, an unmanaged plantation, one that basically is an alien plant stand, and you follow the protocol, it can lead to certification. But if you are managing it according to the requirements where you clear and rehabilitate or restore, and as the rehabilitation part of it could lead to a natural ecosystem. It could lead to either agriculture or persistence of managed plantation forest, authorized and managed, or it can be through rehabilitation to a natural ecosystem. If you follow that, so the standards make provision for that, but it is onerous in that it's difficult in those alien plant clearing operations, as you're aware, to get people to commit to the period that is required to do full restoration. So that's going to be the barrier, is actually implementing and getting people to restore be certified for the 10 years after the plants are removed, and there's no economic return.
Okay.
And then they still have to undergo audits to check that they're carrying out the restoration activities. So that's why we've introduced the landscape concept, where if you're working with very big areas and a number of landowners, then you can always be getting some income into the system while you do the restoration work. So it's more a difficulty of implementation at the moment than it is for the standards to absorb it, if that makes sense.
Okay, so just to, I don't want to go too deep into this because we could talk again for another 5 hours, but what we're saying though is, in order to engage with the process at all, the landscape that we're operating in has to be declared an unmanaged forest. There's no way around that. We can't say this is actually a conservation area or a stewardship area or some other form of landscape. It has to be a landscape that's been classed in terms of this as an unmanaged forest, which is actually an unmanaged plantation, really. Is that
It's an unmanaged
true?
plantation, yes.
Yeah, true or false? You know, basically that's really, so that really is the starting point. Even though it's never ever been a plantation, we have to start from that point.
You have to start with the point that it's as a result of, so the unmanaged plantations are the result of plantation seed at some point, and so so to put it bluntly, we're going to have to test it in various environments and then see how it works. But I think you've hit upon the key issue there, yes. So we will, by testing it.
So I suppose perhaps the question then is, going forward for the next 10 years, what are the chances of changing those policies, or is that going to just be so onerous that we must not even attempt to do it?
The policies will change and morph over time, I suspect. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Ambra. That's quite a tricky question in Southern Africa, because the issue of invasive plants across the region of Southern Africa is a huge one, and it has the potential to be a resource, but then Europe and other countries need this certification, and so we're trying to work in the Western Cape, especially. We're trying to fix the problem.
Yep. Thank you, Val, for your question and the clarification. Yeah, probably. I absolutely support Steve in the way that, of course, we don't really have, you know, we don't know what will happen in 10 years, but I think that even probably just opening up this system to a regional system, you know, and having even other countries with other marketing opportunities and potentially even different type of product requests, probably that could engage more, you know, potential changes to the system in the future, and new market eventually for new products. So yeah, but thank you anyway for the question, Val. Good. I think I'm just aware of timing, so I think that we are already kind of over time for 5 minutes, but that's fine because I think that we had a very nice presentation and a very clear question and answer session. Just to clarify, this webinar was recorded and will also be published on the PEFC YouTube channel. So, you know, if you want to spread the presentation or to share it with other colleagues, there will be a link published probably next week on our YouTube channel. Having said that, this is just a general reminder that the consultation will start from the day of today until the 4th of July to comment on the system. Any comments will be then received and passed on and evaluated as part of the assessment. Thank you very much, Steve, for your time, and thank you all the attendees for your time and your attention. And thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks very
Bye-bye.
much, everyone. Thanks, Umbra. Appreciate it. Okay.
Bye.
ciao.
Thank you.
Bye.